Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
Good to have you guys with us. Thank you to our patrons who make this podcast possible. Also, huge shout out to the people who have been reviewing my book. I put a little post out on social media. I'm up to 95 reviews.
I saw that.
5 more to push me over the edge to 100. So if you are a listener and you have read my book, The Devil Inside, please give that a review on Amazon. Check it out and let me know what you think. And while we're plugging books, why don't you plug your most recent book? Actually, your 2 most recent books.
I do have a couple books. I have Hope 365, which is a daily devotional book, which I probably need now. I need some hope that I'm going to get over these allergies. I am really struggling, people. If you have a cure that I haven't tried, let me know. My mother had a cure that I'm not willing to try. She used to put kerosene on a teaspoon, mix it with honey, and make me swallow it. So,
sounds delicious.
It was wonderful.
Guys, I'm just saying that explains a lot.
I still remember that because it was so horrible. I've upped the ante. I'm now taking some other concoctions that are natural. But
it's now legal in the state of Pennsylvania.
Everything's legal. It's not working yet, though. I did have honey and hot tea this morning, and I'm about ready to have some again. But anyway, Hope 365, you can get off of Amazon. It's a great book if you are struggling day to day and need some daily doses of hope. And I also have a children's book out that is on Amazon. Also is a children's grief book, Robbie and the Special Daisies. Grab that book if you have a child who possibly is going through some grief issues. And thank you, Jimmy, for that book.
Yeah, and I'll put links to both of our books in the description of this podcast. So today, are my kids safe at church? Checklist. We're going to be doing a series based on last week's podcast, the different areas that we mentioned who should have well-trained people, but a lot of people within these organizations don't. But we want to go through each one of those that we mentioned last week, podcast by podcast, and give you a checklist because I think that's an important question. And each of these will be titled, Are My Kids Safe? So this one, are my kids safe at church? And this is your checklist. And checklists are incredibly important. They're very boring, and they're very important. What do I mean by boring and important? So I think about aviation, because aviation is obviously incredibly safe. And pilots are required by the FAA to go through a checklist each and every time they take off. It's not that long of a checklist, but they have to check instruments. There is a specific order to the checklist, and the checklist never changes. It's always the same. Every pilot can probably recite this checklist in their sleep.
And as people who fly, who are passengers, I don't know about you, but I look for the pilot holding that piece of that clipboard. And when I walk on that plane, I like knowing that clipboard is there.
And I think that's part of their training. I don't know. Yes. I'd love to hear from pilots, but I think they have to keep the door open for accountability.
I love seeing that. I like seeing that in the pilot's
I do too.
hand. That makes me, as a passenger on that plane, feel safe.
And they have to read it out loud, too. They can't just, look at it silently, go through the checklist. it has to be read out loud. And both the pilot and the co-pilot have to be present. It has to be recorded onto the black box. There has to be extreme accountability that these pilots go through the same checklist every single time they get into an aircraft. Now, the reason that's important is because checklists and checklists that are put in order are based on all kinds of evidence, and really they're comprised from crashes, things that we've learned from crashes where pilots have to absolutely make sure that everything is in perfect working order as far as instruments. From front to back of the plane, they have to test the rudders. You'll see them do, if you ever watch a plane that's sitting there before it takes off, you'll see the rudder go. You'll see all the flaps go up and down. They're literally checking every part of that, every main component of that aircraft.
I love a window seat. I love watching for those things that you just mentioned.
Yeah, and it's, a checklist itself won't save an aircraft from going down. What does, though, is that checklist combined with training where they are put in every imaginable emergency situation in the flight sim, and they're taught, number one, how to get out of that situation, and number two, that it's possible for the aircraft to do so. You have to have confidence in your ability to think through and process these procedures in an emergency, but you also have to know that your aircraft is capable of doing it. Because if they weren't trained that way, if it was like the way we're trained to get in a car, where you go to driver's ed for 2 weeks and then we don't do checklists when we get in the car. We turn the key and we go. And look at how many accidents there are because of untrained people. Mm-hmm. And this is really important. And I was sharing with you, I saw a video on YouTube, I don't know, a couple weeks ago, and it just caught my attention. And it was a helicopter whose engine failed. And that caught my attention because I have a very good friend who flew Apache helicopters. And he told me that you can land a helicopter easier than you can land an airplane. And that... I never knew that. I never knew that if you have complete engine failure in a helicopter, I just figured that thing's going to spiral and
that's what I would think too.
And you're gone.
Right.
But he told me that was part of their training was, especially in the Army, because there's always a possibility your engine could be taken out and you've got to land it with no engine. So I'm watching this video on YouTube, and this guy's just so calmly talking out loud and talking through it. He said, okay, I lost my engine. So I'm going to initiate checklist. And, he goes through that emergency checklist. And he's just talking through it. And he's gliding through this gorge, cliff on both sides. And he's just so gracefully gliding that down with no engine. And in the video, it's like 4 minutes long. And, the whole time he's eyeballing places on the ground. And he's like, there's a possibility, but... He said, based on this and that, it's probably not level. So I'm going to look for something that's a little further down. I have plenty of time. I still have X. And he's like doing math. And he pulls his phone out and he's doing calculations. And he's so stinking calm the whole time. And he's just talking through what he was trained to do, knowing that the helicopter that he's piloting is fully capable of doing it because he did it in training.
Of landing, right.
So eventually he brings it down and he flares it right at the end, and he touches that thing down so gently. I mean, it was beautiful.
I want to watch that video, by the way.
Oh, my heart was racing the whole time. I could not stop watching it. And then at the end he goes, whenever he landed it, he said, okay, that was a simulation. He said, I really did cut the engine off, but it turned out he had a student pilot. And he did a mock emergency.
That's awesome.
And actually cut the engine off, so it wasn't faked. Right. He actually landed the helicopter with no engine. Why that's important is we have to know in the church, one, that checklists are necessary, and two, that it's possible to keep our kids safe. I see so many people throw their hands up. There are two extremes. There's one extreme where they throw their hands up and they're like, well, there's nothing we can do. Abusers are everywhere. And we just have to submit to the idea why bother? Right.
It's too big.
And then there's the other side of the extreme, which I face more often than not, where church leaders are so arrogant. They're like, checklist, training, what do I need that for? We've been keeping kids safe for the last 30 years, and we know what to, if somebody was creeping on kids, we'd know what to look for. Right. Can you imagine a pilot getting in an aircraft, never having any training whatsoever, having no checklist, not knowing what the aircraft is capable or even how to fly the darn thing, and having that level of arrogance, being like, get away, leave me alone, and they shut the cockpit door and they just try to take
what
off.
You're saying, Jimmy, that this checklist is the same checklist, is boring in that it's repetitive.
Yeah.
But they have to repeat it aloud. They have to go down and actually go through that checklist before every takeoff.
Yes.
In order to be prepared for safety, should something emergent come up. Mm-hmm. And what when you think about our situations in church as being such a viable place for abusers.
Yeah.
Because you have, in some of your bigger churches, especially, hundreds of little children all over the building, all over. Mm-hmm. And within the confines of that building, there are predators.
Right.
I mean, facts will say that. Facts will tell us that. But with the arrogance of, we keep our kids safe. What are you talking about? We have 2 teachers in every classroom. We have people walking them down the halls. They're safe.
Yeah.
With that attitude, it's not going to.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It is
every time.
Yes.
So both sides of those extremes are really dangerous, and we have to have these checklists. Now, this is not necessarily a checklist for church leaders who have an established policy. Maybe that's a whole nother episode in itself, but this is one for you parents. Are my kids safe? This is my checklist.
Right.
This is every time I walk into the door of a church, whether it's my church that I've been at for, 50 years, or it's a new congregation, this checklist should be the same.
Right.
You should ask these questions and go on down through it. But I agree with you. I think churches, we ought to have a checklist that every time we open our doors, before we open our doors, we sit down in the office, we pull the leaders group together, and they go through this checklist and say, okay,
absolutely,
are we doing these things?
Absolutely.
And if we're
do
not,
we have this in order? Do we have this in order? Do we have this in order? And go down through.
Yeah. So we will run through this list. It's not comprehensive, but it's a great start, and it highlights, I think, some of the most important things. But number 1, are my kids safe at church? Checklist. Number 1, does the church have a written policy? Not a verbal policy, not an understood policy that, my kids are safe. We don't have a written policy, but boy, we take it seriously here. Not acceptable. Do you have a written policy? Is it scribed and written in stone?
Why is that so important?
It's important because abusers have what I call selective amnesia. When you have verbal policies, abusers are far more sophisticated than we are. The average abuser is far more sophisticated than we'll ever be. That's just a fact.
Okay.
They're very dynamic, to use our friend Jim's term. They're dynamic. They're not static.
Absolutely.
They're adaptive. They're always changing. And so they will sway a verbal policy and say things like, well, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to hug people.
That's exactly where
nobody ever told me that.
Right.
A written policy puts it in stone, which leads us to these subcategories. Is the policy culturally ingrained into the life of the church? It's not enough to have a written policy. Anybody can click print. But is the policy culturally ingrained into the life of the church? Is it clear, concise, visible, and available? Is it available to every single person? When you walk through the door of a church for the very first time as a visitor, one of the first things you ought to see hanging on the wall right at the check-in desk is the complete cover-to-cover safety policy. It should be available. It should be visible. It should be clear. There should be no question marks over your head as to what your children can expect and how the people are going to keep your kids safe.
I know there are some people who are going to balk at that, at the whole idea of this, but things have changed so much in the past 20 years. I'll use that time frame. It's so different from when you kids were running around in church. I had no clue what the capabilities of what could be done to harm my children.
Well, how about this? Kids. What about the capabilities of what was being done inside that church building?
That I know what was being done, I shake inside because I see how important all of this is.
It's vital. It's vital.
As a parent, that would be step one of making me feel good about attending that church. When I see that policy on the wall, that tells me thought and prayer went into that, into the safety of
and
my
it's
children.
Available.
And it's available.
They're saying, here's what our policy is. Let me explain this to you. That should be one of the first things that they explain, not how wonderful the church is and, what their programs are.
Your kids matter, and we are working as hard as we can to keep them safe.
And, another question within the policy, are the leaders the only ones on committees? Or does it include lay members, including both male and female? If the leaders are the only ones who show up on these committees within the policy, it's not a good policy. It's not safe. Okay, checklist number 2. Does the church keep registered sex offenders away? This is a huge one to me. This is a deal breaker for me. If a church invites sex offenders, registered pedophile sex offenders, who are even in the same building at the same time as children, for me, that's a deal breaker. I will never attend a church that allows registered sex offenders to be anywhere near kids. I'm not talking the children's wing. I'm talking inside the building. And Diane Langberg agrees.
Right.
I just read an excellent article that she wrote that talked about sex offenders in the church. And she's like, look, these guys don't stop. They won't stop. Putting accountability partners next to them doesn't stop them from abusing kids. They don't belong.
To use
near
your
kids.
analogy with the flying, we would never see someone on that plane who has the potential to blow that plane up.
Right? Would you put a terrorist in?
We stop them before they.
Would you put a terrorist in first class with a U.S. a flight marshal?
No, absolutely not. No.
Well, we're keeping an eye on him. Doesn't matter. He's blown up planes before.
Right.
He doesn't belong on an airplane.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Great point. So ask if any sex offenders attend, who they are, and what their crimes are. If sex offenders are integrated into the church, walk away. Find out if the leadership has secret agreements with offenders. We've talked about this a lot here. These covenant agreements, as they call them, are absolute nonsense. I'm telling you.
They're dangerous. It's dangerous as fire.
It is a deal with the devil.
Yeah,
it's a backdoor deal with the devil. The majority of churches that have them do not tell the congregations, or if they go as far as to tell the congregation that they have these devil agreements, I'm going to start naming them that. Instead of covenant agreements, I'm going to call them devil agreements. Because that's what they are. I don't care. It's what they are. If they have a devil agreement, if they do tell you that they have a devil agreement, do they let you see it? Will they give you a copy of it? And will they tell you who the sex offender is that this devil agreement is contracted with? If they're not willing to give you a name of the registered sex offender who's on the public sex offender registry,
there's something wrong. Big time wrong.
There is a culture of secrecy and protection of people who don't need protection. And the opposite of that, unprotection for the people who need protection. Number 3, are background checks done on all volunteers? And is this strictly adhered to? Background checks should be current. They should be on file. Background checks do very little to stop abusers.
I was going to say, you and I have discussed this many times before. That's not a cure-all. That's not a cover-all.
No, but it's also necessary.
Excuse me. It is necessary.
Because there is the occasional convict who will slip in to a volunteer position or a paid position.
So it is necessary, and everybody should willingly agree to this.
Yeah, in Pennsylvania it's required, so we have to. I mean, we're in big trouble.
Right.
If we have people teaching and we don't have a background check, it has to be current within 5 years. Every 5. In fact, we just went through a round a couple weeks ago that we had to update because they were within that 5-year window.
Right.
We had to do complete new background checks on all of any and every volunteer that works with kids. Number 4, are children taught how to protect their own bodies, and do they know who to report to? That's a huge one, and we've talked about Lauren. Lauren's Kids. Lauren Book has the organization Lauren's Kids, and our church annually uses her curriculum for kids. It's the Safer, Smarter Kids curriculum, and we just adapted it to a Christian environment because it's written as a secular curriculum. Which is very easy to do. To adapt it is super easy. So are children taught how to defend themselves, how to protect their own bodies, what the boundaries are? And the second part of that, do they know who to report to? That's very important because abusers often will intimidate or they'll threaten a kid. If you tell anybody, I'll kill your pets or kill your parents.
Right.
We trained our kids to ignore those threats because
that's extremely important. Yes.
Because 90% of abusers are known to the child, known really well to the child and their family, and those threats are idle. They're not. Usually, they're not going to kill.
Right.
Pets and parents and things like that. In extreme circumstances, that happens. We're gonna have my friend Les Ferguson.
You're thinking about Les.
That was his wife and son who was sexually abused were murdered. But that was because he was reported by Les, not not by the son. And that was nothing but a revenge.
I think it's so important for children to know the boundaries with their own bodies, and I really like that, how to keep themselves safe, as well as I'm sure there would be more than one person to report to.
Yeah, and that shouldn't be a guesswork.
Right.
They should know.
They should know.
At our church, what we do periodically is we stand up in front of the church and say, here are the people.
Okay, and I think
this
that's
is the group
so
of people.
important.
Here are their faces.
Okay.
These are the people that you can tell, even if you feel uncomfortable, and we let them know, like, it doesn't have to be sexual abuse.
Exactly.
If somebody just makes you uneasy.
Yes. I think that's so very important.
Number 5, are the sanctuary and hallways a free-for-all, or are children structured and have to be with adults? That's kind of an important one because when there's a free-for-all, when kids are just all over the place and you don't know where they are, and they're in this room or that room, and parents are constantly looking for their kids and they don't know where they are. That disorder, that lack of structure, that free-for-all for the kids is it just makes them very easy targets. And right away, I mean, I hadn't thought of this for the podcast, but just talking about this out loud, it reminded me of, I had done a training at a Christian university, and a woman told me about a time that she was... I think she was a preacher's kid. I actually have it written up because I asked her if I could use that when I do trainings.
Okay.
But I think she was a preacher's kid, and she was just downstairs playing with her friends, broke off from her friends for a second. A guy walks in a side door, somebody she didn't know, never saw the guy before, wasn't part of the church, walked inside, pulled her into a side room, molested her, and walked out the same door.
Oh.
And here she was in her 50s or 60s saying, I'm still trying to process this. Yeah. And she said, she has PTSD. She was going to counseling in her 50s or 60s. It still affected her that many years later. That was nothing. That could have been so easily prevented just by having structure.
Right. Exactly.
And it wasn't her fault at all.
Oh, no.
That was just a church that had no structure. There was an opportunist who he saw a door that was open, probably looked in the window, saw this little girl playing alone, walked in.
What a shame that we have
no
to
adults
think
were
that
around.
way, isn't it?
It happens.
What a shame. I know
happens.
it happens. It happens more often than we ever would like to think.
Yeah.
It's just sad that it does.
Yep. Number 6, is there an evacuation plan that's practiced, including fire drills? It is unbelievable that I don't think, if my memory's right, I don't think that I ever remember a church responding in the affirmative when I ask them, do you guys practice fire drills? When I do trainings, it's not just sexual abuse. That's not the only threat to our kids. Do you practice fire drills? And I've never had anybody say yes.
I'm sure not.
Right. Our kids go through fire drills in schools constantly. They have to, by law. They have to.
Right.
Daycares, by law, have to do fire drills. They have to actually practice them. Lockdowns, things like that. If somebody comes in wielding a knife or a gun, do you have an evacuation/lockdown plan in place? There are all kinds of threats. Somebody like that walks in. Somebody notices that somebody walks in a side door and grabs a little girl by the hand. There should be an immediate lockdown plan that goes into effect as part of your policy. Is there an evacuation plan that's practiced? Not that's talked about, that's practiced. Number 7, are the outside grounds included as a safety zone? Your policy should include everything inside, outside, underneath, above. It brings me back to
I think of the big parking areas in a lot of churches and in country churches, the country setting, kids playing hide and seek while mom and dad are talking, kids going off picking flowers, they're shooting hoops. If there's, a lot of them have basketball in the parking areas. Any number of things that can be a hazard.
Yeah, I mean,
children.
people could be kidnapped. They could be raped. They could be
any number of things, and it just
run over.
Seconds.
I went to a church out of state where I wasn't there when it happened, but one of the church members got in their car. There was a little kid playing in the parking lot, and they ran over and killed this little girl.
Yeah, horrible.
It happens.
It does.
Do you have the outside included as a safety zone? Right. It's not like this is a tack-on optional thing. This has to be part of your policy.
Right.
And then number 8, again, this is not a comprehensive list, but this is the last one. Does the safety policy apply to small groups as well? Because what I see a lot of churches do a lot of times is, with arrogance, they'll say, well, we keep our kids safe, and these are churches that 9.5 times out of 10, they have devil agreements, and they'll argue till they're blue in the face. Well, we keep our kids safe. And I'm like, well, first of all, no, you don't, because you have a registered child rapist in the pews. You signed a secret agreement with them. Your church doesn't even know you have one. And then that policy doesn't apply once that person steps foot outside of your church. He can go to any one of the small groups, and you have no safety policy that applies to your small groups. And if you're a church that has even one small group, but imagine a church that has 100 small groups, that is a lot of opportunity for abusers.
Think about it.
To really abuse in people's homes.
Loose with policy that many don't have any policy.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Right. Just don't think about it. Or, well, it's my home. I know what goes on inside my home. I can sit here and attest, no, we don't.
Right.
I sure didn't know what was going on inside of my home.
Yeah.
So, blew that out of the water right there.
Yeah. So I would start with these things. If you guys have more that you want to add to this, we're open.
Jimmy, where does the church start, or where do parents start? Real quickly, I know we're pressed for time here. When there is no policy, how do they start at the very beginning?
So I plugged this book a couple weeks ago, but see if I can find it on my shelf. I'm not real well organized. This one. So this is Boz Trevijan and Shira Berkovitz. They co-authored the book, The Child Safeguarding Policy Guide for Churches and Ministries. This is designed to help you build a policy from the ground up. I mean, it will walk you through step by step.
Now, I think you said this was written by attorneys. It's
Boz is an attorney.
Right, Boz is. So it's going to be what you need.
And there's no excuse.
Right.
I mean, this book is out there. There's no excuse to say that, well, we don't know where to start. Yeah, you actually do.
Right there. Okay.
And if you didn't before, you do now.
Okay.
Start with that and get that policy written and get it implemented. Put it into practice, make it visible, make it available, make it clear. Get a written policy. That's our checklist.
I was going to say, then that's our truth bomb. Get that written policy. Get going with it. There's the beginning. There's the first step.
That's it. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you, listeners, for tuning into this episode, and we'll catch you next round.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron, and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.